Hello everybody, welcome back to High Ground. My name is Tanner, and today we're going to be going over some predictions for 6th Invitational 2024, but not my predictions, the predictions of some other people. I do have a hand in it a little bit because there are some sort of tie breaks, and we'll talk about that in a moment. These are the teams as seeded in their respective groups. So G2, FaZe, W7M, and Sonics are the top 4 seeds for the event, and then the next 4 teams are the next 4 seeds, so on and so forth. Not necessarily in the order that they're presented here, but each of the seed groups, groups of 4, I guess, were sort of randomized and then put in groups A, B, C, D, and they ended up like this. And some of the teams maybe look a little bit more competitive than others, but that's the nature of having a semi-random system. Okay, let's go over to a spreadsheet for just a moment. We're going to be coming back to this, but for now, let's see what we're actually working with. So I have the predictions of Lycan, Lynx, DevMarta, Dezachu, Meepy, and Jesse. Keep in mind that Meepy and Jesse only predicted the winner of each group as opposed to each placement in each group, so a little bit less data to work with in that way, but still not a ton of data by any means, but still enough to get a general idea. Over here we have the sort of consensus predictions. The teams highlighted in green were unanimously chosen to be in that position. The teams highlighted in this orange color were not unanimous, but pretty clear that those are the predictions, the placements that people predicted them to be in on average. And then the teams in red, it's pretty much fully ambiguous. If you average everything out, they pretty much are dead tied. And so I mostly just gave the nod to the more experienced teams like Nip over Geek, Wolves over Bliss, VP over Bleed, things like that. Okay, let's go back to the tier list format to talk about this a little bit more. So I'll be rearranging this as we go. Starting with Dark Zero over G2. 3 of the 6 predictors chose Dark Zero in the first place position, whereas G2 only had the 1, and then G2 were predicted more favorably over the other team, so they ended up in second. Dark Zero with some pretty exciting roster changes, bringing on Nafe and probably more importantly to most people, Bolo, although we'll see if Nafe is actually the thing that they need. It seemed like more of a supporting player was where they were struggling in general. They kept swapping out their 5th player, and for this event, they decided to swap out 2 players, so just Pambazoo, NJR, and Canadian returning, with Bolo and Nafe being added. So we'll see what they do. Even if they don't do especially well, I'm sure people will be very excited to see what they do nonetheless. G2 reigning world champions, and they've not been doing super well super recently, but that's mostly just been like T3 events that I'm sure they haven't been taking super seriously, so probably you shouldn't take their placements super seriously. I'm sure that they're just trying to get a little bit of practice in their off season while also enjoying some of their time off. But now it's down to crunch time. SI coming up in just a few weeks, so I'm sure they're hunkering down. And don't underestimate these guys. Obviously, reigning world champions. They were underestimated at the previous SI. They ended up winning the whole thing, and they're one of the teams that I wouldn't be surprised to win the whole thing. Then we have Ninjas in Pajamas, Geek, and Fearex. All 3 of these teams were in the same group at the Atlanta Major. Fearex, previously known as Sandbox, you might know them under that banner a little bit more. And Geek did outperform Nip at the event. Not only did they take first place in their group, but they did better in Swiss than Nip did. So Geek beat Nip in their group 8-7, so very close affair, obviously. And then Nip ended up advancing, beating Fearex 2-0 along the way, and then they also beat Crest. In Swiss, let me check who each team played. Geek, they beat W7M, they beat BDS, so really crazy wins to have. And then they lost to G2, lost to Los, and then finally they beat Wolves. Whereas Nip, they beat Virtus.pro, but then they lost to FaZe and Los and SSG to be eliminated. So even though a much better performance from Geek at the most recent event, and even against NIP, the better showing, I'm going to give the nod to Ninjas in Pajamas. They have a lot of experience, right? They're just a more experienced team. Geek, I think they need one more good showing at an event to solidify themselves as like a top team. And funnily enough, in this group, 2 former world champions, the 2023 champions in G2 and the 2021 champions in Ninja Pajamas. A very different roster for Nip, however. Then Fearex, yeah, everybody chose them as last place in the group. Pretty clear. If you're going to lock in one team to be eliminated from the group stage in general, it's probably them. I think all the other groups are much harder to call in terms of who will probably be eliminated. In Group B, FaZe was the unanimous choice for first place, but the rest of the group need to move things around just a little bit. SSG was pretty clearly the second place team, And just like we saw in Group A, 3 of these teams were in the same group at the Atlanta Major. I'll get this out of the way now. D+, yeah. Most people think that they're probably going to be the last place team in this group, but we'll see. They have a sort of exciting pickup in Damali, which could work out well for them. They were at one point, looking to be one of the best teams in the world, but that was a while ago now. They haven't been very impressive recently. Maybe a few okay moments, but nothing spectacular compared to the rest of these teams. And Bliss, you might not know them, but and especially if you only watch like the finals of events or whatever, they didn't get very close to making that. But what they did do, they almost beat SSG and they almost beat Wolves in their group. So let me look at what happened here. It was Wolves against Bliss in the first round. Bliss won 8-6, so they did beat Wolves, but they still have to win another match to advance. Space Station beat Alpha Aetheris 7-3, and then Wolves also beat Alpha Aetheris 2-0. So Bliss versus Space Station, SSG won 8-7. They were one round away from losing to Bliss. Bliss would have advanced. And then Wolves versus Bliss for the second place spot goes all 3 maps, goes to round 15 on the 3rd map, and once again, Bliss loses in the 15th round. So they are one round away from making first place in their group over SSG. They were one round away from making second place in their group over Wolves. So, maybe this was just a bit of a fluke. Maybe SSG and Wolves were really preparing for other teams a lot more and they weren't ready, whatever the case. Good showing by Bliss. Got to give them a little bit of credit there. So that'll put them in the 4th place spot, even though based on what everybody predicted, Wolves and them were pretty much in a dead tie. But Wolves, they've made it to the top 8, and now that majors have been expanded, top 11 quite a lot. So a lot of international experience. They usually place fairly well, if not super spectacularly. And so I'll give them the nod there. And Group B is as such. Group C, the not aforementioned, but the so-called group of death. W7M, the clear tournament favorites. They won the last major. They won the major before that. They were the runners-up at the most recent SI, SI 2023, where, probably they could have won, but they ran out of gas or they were just outmatched against G2, whatever the case. Good stuff by G2 there, but W7M, maybe on a different day they could have taken down that event and made it 3 in a row. But now they have the opportunity again to make it 3 in a row. Copenhagen into Atlanta into SI 2024. They are the very, very, very clear favorite. There's not been a more clear favorite at an event since like Prime Penta / G2 days. These guys were like the only other dynasty. It's been such a long time since any team won back-to-back events, and again, not to mention their second place finish at SI 2023. One little trend, which is fun to notice, we have the 3 most recent SI runners-up in this group. W7M, as I just mentioned a bunch of times, they were the second place team at SI 2023, Virtus Pro second place at 2022, and then Liquid second place at 2021. And then M80 even second place, showing at the most recent Gamers 8, another international event. Okay, so as far as the rest of the group goes, interestingly, Liquid was chosen as the last place team in the group. They haven't been super good lately, and for a long time, I feel like years even, they were chosen as event favorites or contenders to win the event, and they came close a few times, but they never quite made it there. And maybe Neskin Palu or past their prime, or maybe it's time for them to finally boss up and win an SI. We'll have to see, but the predictors aren't a big fan of them coming into this. And I think this can also be applied a little bit to M80 and Virtus Pro. Virtus Pro, historically very good team at international lands, but at the last 2, they've come up a little bit short, and M80, same sort of thing. Even though they placed second at Gamers 8, they did quite poorly at both of the last 2 majors, going 1-3 and 0-3, so 1-6 overall at the last 2 majors, even though they went directly into the Swiss phase. And to be fair, if they'd gone into groups, they probably would have padded their record with a few more wins because the groups are easier than Swiss, but still, they flopped very, very hard. A lot of people thought that they would be going to the finals, maybe even winning the events, but not the case here. We'll have to see if their roster changes pan out for them. And then we have Bleed, who not world beaters by any means, but they did show up fairly impressively. I think shocked a few people, beat a few NA teams and lost to the other ones. More specifically, they beat M80, they beat Sonic 7-4, 7-3, good showings, and they lost to FaZe, they lost to Dark Zero, and then they lost to SSG. And they lost to Dark Zero in round 15, and they lost to SSG in map 3. So good stuff by them overall, not enough to make it into the top 8, but certainly enough to give them at least a little bit of credit. The rest of the group is as such based on predictions. Let me double check. Oh yeah, VP and Bleed tied in the predictions, but I'll give the nod to VP. You know, a lot more experienced, and they made it to top 11 both times, right? Let me double check. They fell to, who do they lose to? They lost to M&M in the final round of Swiss in Copenhagen, and then at Atlanta, they lost to BDS 2-0. So lost to a couple of other European teams to not make top 8. Top 11 is obviously still impressive, but maybe not as impressive as people expected them to be. So yeah, that's Group C. And then finally, we have Group D. I think in most people's assessment, the least interesting, the least competitive group. Not a lot of that is to do with, well, I mean, obviously the teams that are in the group. What else would it be? Scars, Fury, and Falcons. I don't think people have super high expectations, and then maybe people even underrating the other teams, Sonics and Los. So let's adjust the groups as they were predicted. People have Sonics as the consensus #1 pick, with Los not too far behind, and then Falcons were actually unanimously chosen as third place. So we have a lock in first place for FaZe and W7M, a lock in last place for FearX, formerly Sandbox, and then a lock in third place for Falcons, which I think is a little bit funny. And then finally, the last two teams, Scars and Fury. Let's start from the top though. Sonics, generally a pretty consistently performing international team, and I guess even within the region, but we haven't talked about that too much. Shaky sometimes, but they usually pull it out by the end. They have a lot of top 4 and top 8 finishes in general at majors and SIs. Usually a force to be reckoned with, but they've yet to go they've gone deep, but they've not gone to the finals, and they certainly haven't won an event. Los did make it to a final in the most recent event. Atlanta, they lost to W7M. What are you going to do? That's W7M, but still making it to the grand final is impressive. We'll have to see. I think they're maybe even being a little bit underrated here. I think a lot of people think that was a bit of a fluke, and we'll have to see if they're right or not. Falcons, they sort of lit the world on fire. Maybe not to the fullest extent in Copenhagen, but they were not able to make it to the most recent event. They lost their MENA qualifier spot to Geeke, so I think a lot of people think Falcons are not the hottest kids on the block now, and we'll have to see if that's true or not, if Geeke are just really good and Falcons were just slightly behind them. Third place in the group is still respectable. That's still good enough to make it into the upper bracket. I'm sure they'll be happy enough to not place 4th or 5th, and maybe obviously they'll be gunning for more, but let's see what they can actually do. Finally, we have Scars and Fury, and they each have a decent performance under their belts. Scars, certainly a better one. In Copenhagen, they made it to the top 8, whereas in Atlanta, and both majors, keep in mind, they were seeded automatically into the Swiss phase, whereas Fury had to go through the play-ins, and they fell in the play-ins both times. Not super good stuff from them, but they were closest last time at least once. Talk about it in just a second. Scars, yeah, they made top 8. I think let's just go over their matchups really quickly. They beat SSG in the last round, but to get there, they lost to W7M brutally 7-1, but then they got a win over Revan, they got a win over D+, and to be fair, those were like 2 of the worst teams at that event. They lost to NIP, and then they beat SSG to make top 8. So not incredible wins, but still making top 8 is making top 8. And then at Atlanta, they lost to G2, they lost to Los, and they lost to SSG. So, SSG made top 8, Los made top 2, G2, where do they place? They made top 8, yeah, losing to BDS. So, some solid, a solid performance from Scars at the first event, and then not the worst losses ever at the second event, even if they went 0-3 overall. And then Fury, yeah, pretty poor at Copenhagen. Fortunately for them, it's not the most recent major, it's the previous one. Let me find it here, lost to Sandbox, not great, and then they lost to M&M, and then in Atlanta, they were in the same group as DZ and G2, so a couple of tough opponents, and they do fall to both of them, but they made it close. They lost to G2 7-3. That one's not close. But then they beat Knights pretty convincingly 2-0. And then Dark Zero, they go all 3 maps. They go to round 15, and then they fall just like Bliss did against Wolves. And so, yeah, a good showing by them. They still got outplaced by Scars, technically, because Scars, were seeded straight into the Swiss phase, but at least Fury went 3-3 on maps, whereas Scars went 0-3. So I'll give the nod to Scars, because even though it was the older one, their performance in Copenhagen is is better than anything Fury did by a decent margin, I'd say. And that does it for the tier list. So let me know if any of these things look ridiculous to you. I feel like this will be pretty popular. Like you could move around maybe these 3 teams, or well, these 2 teams a little bit and these 2, but these are probably the top 2. These are probably 3 and 4 in most people's opinions. These 3 could maybe move around a little bit. These 4 could probably move around, and then you could switch these 2 and maybe move these around a little bit, but I don't think anyone's going to be like, oh, no way, why do you not have Fury as number 1 in the group? Things like that. So yeah, but do let me know if there's anything you disagree with, and I guess I will catch you guys next time.